What do Bridgerton, Star Wars, the term goblin mode, and the Barbie movie all have in common? That's right. They're part of the discourse, the constant online discourse. They're also all episode topics from my new favorite show, Material Girls, a pop culture podcast that uses critical theory to understand the zeitgeist. If you like culture study, you have to check out this bi-weekly show hosted by two queer Canadian academics who love to get to the bottom of why certain things become popular and what that popularity tells us about society. Each episode, they tackle a piece of pop culture, whether that's a book, movie, meme, or song, and ask, why this and why now? And guess what? I was on a recent episode about athleisure, and let me tell you, these hosts, they do their research. We talked about post-World War II manufacturing, second-wave feminism, the neoliberal collapse of work and leisure, the rise of Chip Wilson's Lululemon empire, and so much more. Be sure to check out Material Girls wherever you get your podcasts or head to materialgirlspod.com to learn more. That's materialgirlspod.com.
So this past spring, I designed and led a course called Taylor Swift and Confessional Writing. And it was like 3 to 4 weeks into this that it became apparent that Taylor Swift was seriously dating Maddie Healy. And I was gobsmacked by the degree of grief the people in the class felt. It was like, can I even be a fan of her anymore? And I'd only heard of Maddie Healy occasionally, like, I've listened to a couple songs by the 1975.
Same.
Like,
that was where I was in my Maddie Healy knowledge as well. Yeah.
Everyone who's been to a brewery on one of the coasts.
Yes.
You know?
A good way of putting it.
I immediately started looking into it, and I found it to be so illuminating because this was one of the first times I'd encountered completely sincere celebrity outrage that I had no pre-existing take on.
This is the Culture Study Podcast, and I'm Anne Helen Peterson.
I'm Margaret H. Willison, and I am a podcaster, a culture writer, and I work as faculty for the company Not Sorry Productions.
I think both of our past being very online for the last decade plus makes it so that we're very familiar with like the contours of this outrage. But this, I think, felt slightly different. It felt like a culmination in some ways. And we're going to get into all of that. But I think we should also talk about the fact that like being mad at celebrities is not new, right? And we're not going to talk today about people who have like committed crimes, right?
No.
We're not talking about being mad at people who are sexual abusers. Like, we're not talking about being mad at Harvey Weinstein, right? We're talking more about like anger at people's decisions that are usually somewhat low stakes, or people's affiliations with other people who seem not on brand, right?
Right.
And that can even mean like things like they have not been as thoughtful in the way that they've talked about other people, right? Like there's just a lot here. and a lot of it too is like having big feelings about people who you don't personally know, and how that can sometimes be framed as outrageous, over like feminine, like all these feminized emotions, all these sorts of things. And so we're going to try to situate some of these feelings, I think.
That's the goal.
Big feelings about celebrities. This is normal. This is totally normal. And we just want to go in some of the crannies of it.
I'm excited.
The common refrain that you often see online is that like people with large platforms, so celebrities, people with a lot of people watching them, have a responsibility to use those platforms for quote unquote good. And I think we saw this around Black Lives Matter. We saw this around how people are talking about how you should use your platform for Israel and Palestine. We saw this around like anti-Trumpness, like all sorts of things. And what is your thinking right now about what a celebrity owes other people, owes its fans, but also just owes the public?
I think what a celebrity owes the public is a coherent personal understanding of how they want to interact with politics. that is really as much as we can demand of them. They should know what they're doing, and they should understand why they're doing it. And, that can be being Olivia Rodrigo. She has very deliberately decided to make abortion access a crucial issue in her current stadium tour, right? So she is giving out birth control and other materials related to that at all of her shows. That's like an overtly political thing that we don't normally let pop stars do. We're normally like, stick with singing. But right now, in this moment, it's really well received because it's reflective of the relationship that she has with her audience. And it's reflective of how she wants to be in culture. Like, she wants to be somebody with a point of view. She wants to be somebody pushing conversations forward. On the flip side, you have Taylor Swift.
Right.
If Taylor Swift did that at this stage in her career, a lot of times people will be like, why doesn't Taylor Swift do things like this with her platform? And I guess I would point to the fact that, like, she is a blonde, thin woman publicly dating an NFL tight end. And, like, I can't imagine a scenario where that would have been a controversial pairing. But because of how much scrutiny is already on her, because of how many people are already invested in her narrative, it's like, well, this is obviously a CIA stunt. This is like Joe Biden has orchestrated this to win the 2024 election.
Right.
So there's more complexity to that than we imagine. And Olivia Rodrigo, at the outset of her career, can establish some particular rules of engagement. Taylor Swift is renegotiating 20 years of engagement she's already established. And that's a much, much more challenging task. And I would say the same is true of Beyonce.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think one thing historically and you mentioned this, is that there has been this expectation that performers should stay in their lane in some capacity, right? Like, singers should sing and movie stars should be beautiful and act in movies. And I think that expectation has mostly been levied on white performers. It's like whiteness should not be political, which, that's a statement in and of itself.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas performers of color, there's always been an expectation that, like, you're, in part because, like, your very presence, your popularity is political. That
is understood to be political.
Yes, that there is an expectation that you should also, like, if you don't speak out, if you are a person of color, then, like, somehow you aren't using your platform in the way that is expected. But I think, like, what we now expect of Taylor Swift is also what is a cultural expectation of white women more generally, which is, like, you can't be complacent. Like, it's not enough.
And the thing that people will point to the most specifically with Taylor Swift, and this came up a lot with Matt Healy because he'd made controversial comments around queerness and about queer people. And they were like, well, she has declared herself to be a queer ally and she has used queer-coded imagery in all of her work. Therefore, she is profiting off her queer fans. And, like, therefore, like, she can't profit off of them and then, like, make her concerts not a safe space by possibly dating someone who said some stuff we don't like.
Right. Well, and I think that, like, some of this connects to larger star theory, which is essentially that, like, a star needs to have a coherent image, right? And when something happens, when they date someone, when they say something, when they're caught doing something that does not fit within that coherent image, that is when it becomes scandalous. So we can look at her connection to Matty Healy as scandalous because of exactly what you were laying out. Whereas, like, Olivia Rodrigo, maybe there would be some scandal if she hadn't done the work, both in the lyrics to her songs and in other parts of her image, to separate herself from this image as a child star.
Yeah.
Like, Britney, for instance, like, did not necessarily do that work, right? Like, there are other stars who have not successfully made that transition, whereas I think Olivia Rodrigo and her team have very successfully allowed her to transition into an adult with a point of view and a feminist and reproductive rights-minded point of view.
And that's not to say that she doesn't get any pushback. She has gotten significant pushback from conservatives, but that doesn't disrupt her star image. That augments it.
So let's get to listener questions because this will give us an opportunity to talk about Maddie Healy even more. This is from Z.
Whenever Maddie Healy is back in the news for whatever he has done this time, there's a ton of conversation on social media about his famous friends like Taylor Swift and Phoebe Bridgers and how disappointed people are that they're friends. Where does this expectation that famous people should not be friends with controversial people come from? Is this a shift in general approaches to friendships, or do we have different expectations of famous people?
Okay, so this is an opportunity for us to outline what makes Maddie Healy not a great person. I don't even know how to say this,
Maddie
right?
Healy, right. This is the thing. It's really what made Maddie Healy a complex factor in understanding Taylor Swift's star image.
Right. And then I also am wary of saying, he's complex when he said shitty things.
Right.
Does saying shitty things make you a shitty person? Sometimes I don't know. This is where this is why we're doing this episode. So let's talk about the things that he has said that are shitty.
It was an array of things.
Yeah.
There was appearing on a podcast and telling a story about masturbating to really racist pornography. There was being on a podcast and laughing along good-naturedly while the host and his friend made a lot of really disgusting comments about the rapper Ice Spice. And then there was just a general trollishness to how he interacted with the expectation that he should perform progressive, woke, exact political beliefs that everybody who listens to him want him to have. That at every moment he had to be performing this version of himself. And I would say if you want to do a deep dive on Maddie Healy's whole deal, Gia Tolentino had a New Yorker profile of him that came out around this time that is incredibly illuminating and gives you a sense of his whole thing.
Yeah.
But the part that doesn't encompass is I think the number one thing Maddie Healy did that was so bad is go from existing at one level of fame to existing at a completely different level of fame.
Well, and I even think about this, for all celebrities, the amount of access that we have, not only to the things that they are directly putting out via Twitter and other forms of social media, but also the amount of talking that they're doing on podcast, the amount of the lack of management.
Right.
There is just so much available discourse for fans comparatively.
Yes.
I'm thinking about Marilyn Monroe, early 1950s, one of the most famous people in the world. The amount of access that you had to her in interviews was so little. It was so curated. And this includes photography.
Yeah.
The only photos that you would see, except for naked photos that were taken when she was trying to make rent. And that were published in
that were
large
sort of
scale
weaponized against her once she was sufficiently famous.
Yes. But then there were other any photos that you'd see in Life magazine. This was pre-paparazzi. We have to remember that too.
We didn't even have a word for it yet.
And then all of these interviews sanctioned and controlled by her studio. And she couldn't say things out of turn. What Maddie Healy was able to do in public, was able to say in public, is unimaginable.
Yeah.
70 years ago, right? So there's just so much more information, and that does not excuse anything, but that does allow us to contextualize just how much information we have.
It particularly doesn't excuse anything when you have the most convenient counterexample in the world, which is Travis Kelce has a very popular podcast, and he had that podcast for years before he ever got together with Taylor Swift. And when they first got together and I heard about that podcast, I was oh, okay.
Oh, no.
T-minus 30 seconds until everybody's melting down about this. But people have combed the transcripts. I have no doubt of it. And the most terrible thing we found is that he made really adorably dumb tweets when he was in college. So it is absolutely possible to exist in this media environment and still just be fundamentally decent. And Maddie Healy didn't succeed at that.
Those tweets are such a great example of there's this understanding that like if you can get into like the pre-celebrity person, right? Like
Yeah.
their real essence, that will tell you like what is actually at the heart of the person before all of the like celebrity smoothing.
Right.
And like I don't necessarily think that's true. That's a story that we tell ourselves, but at the same time, like there is the proof of Travis Kelce's essence is just like looking at squirrels, right?
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I think we both agree that authenticity is a fake concept invented by middle-aged white men to inflate the value of vintage concert t-shirts. But operating in a world where people care about it still.
At the heart of this question, though, we have to talk a little bit about friendship and association. And I think that this, I'm going to draw a tenuous connection here to political polarization because I think that there, historically, you could be friends with various people of various political persuasions, and the differences in your politics would not be that stark.
Right.
The exception to that, I would say, was like in classic Hollywood, if you were associating with someone who is associated with like the Hollywood 10 or the Red Scare. Otherwise, it's like, oh yeah, of course, these various stars who have like some of whom are probably pretty racist and some of whom are not, like everyone was consorting with everyone else in ways that weren't viewed as problematic.
And part of why the Red Scare in Hollywood was so powerful is because it was a complete reversal on what the understanding was. I mean, up until World War II, being a socialist was like absolutely fine, kind of patriotic, totally chill. And then suddenly our relationship with the Soviets shifted and it was like, uh-oh.
Yeah.
All of you guys who like went to one luncheon, you're in trouble now.
Yes.
You better name everybody else who was at that luncheon.
Yeah.
Are you too friendly with unions?
Yeah. And I think too, like, even when you think about, I don't know, stars in the 1980s, like, if you look at press photographs, like, there are people who are like, oh, here's me with Ronald Reagan, right? Like, here's Jane Fonda with Ronald Reagan or something. Like, I actually don't know if that picture exists. That might be a bridge too far, but Jane Fonda is a chameleon, right? Like, she has
Jane
been
Fonda's
friends
a
with many
wild
people.
outlier.
Yes.
In that respect. She is a figure who's always insistently politicized her star image, even when she received massive, massive blowback and punishment for it.
And so I think that, like, what we've come to understand now, and I think this has become more acute post-Trumpism, is that, like, if you are friends with someone who voted for Trump, or conversely, if you are friends with someone who voted for Biden, that you can't be friends with that person.
Yeah.
That is a betrayal of your politics. And that's another conversation to have. But that's part of why people are angry, I think.
Yeah, but there was definitely the question where it's like, have all friendships changed that way? And it's like, kind of. Like, Taylor Swift's going to have it worse than we are. But, like, we are all scrutinized in this way, just the same. Yeah. I remember when Sydney Sweeney was just on the upswing with fame. And, like, people realized that her family might be conservative. And, like, suddenly it was like, well, wait, then, but is Sydney Sweeney conservative? And now the conservatives are kind of like, well, yeah, she is. And she's also conventionally femininely hot. So, like, she's our girly now.
Listen, she grew up in Spokane, Washington, which is 2 hours from where I grew up, which is where the good mall was. And it would
so
be
important.
It is hard to grow up in that area and not be conservative.
Not have any Trump voters in your family.
Yes, 100%. And you are not responsible for your family's voting history. Like, friends are different than family in this capacity. But yeah, I mean, this is a hard one.
Well, I think it is also just so complicated. The thing that I would always come back to with this is that, like, especially at the outset of Taylor Swift's relationship with Matty Healy, like, she has known him for 10 years, right? Yeah. Like, they've been in each other's orbit and they've been friends for that long. And so what I would say to my students is I was like, can you entertain the possibility that she actually knows him better than you do?
Right.
Like, he doesn't seem great, but there's all this contextual reason why he may be performing shittiness. If you read about him, that's very in line with him. And then there's also just like context collapse, which is as soon as he went into that stratosphere, it's like he was doing the Nazi salute at concerts. And it's like he was doing the Nazi salute to indicate that he thought Kanye West and Donald Trump were fascists.
Yeah.
He was not doing it to express his allegiance with it. And it's like, well, what is he doing the Nazi salute for at all? The mere fact that he feels comfortable doing it is sus. And what I think this is we have the allegiance to the stars that we love, and we know they're imperfect. But one of the ways you purify yourself, one of the ways you identify, I love Taylor Swift, but I'm still a good person, is by scrutinizing satellite figures of Taylor Swift that you don't have that degree of investment in. And just being like, I'm a good Taylor Swift fan because I'm going to make 16 posts about how problematic Maddie Healy is. And that is how I am going to show that even though I still admire this complex, complicated, and imperfect star, I am not imperfect in the same ways she is. I am not failing to show up in the ways I know she is because I can say this guy who I didn't ever care about before is like absolutely terrible.
That is a very convincing theory to me. Like, it's not wrong, right? It's like It's a way that we process our fandom.
And
right?
You know what I did not want to be? Or you know what nobody wants to be on the internet? The person being like, well, yeah, he did a Nazi salute, but like, not that kind of Nazi salute.
Right. Like, I
don't want to be
myself in this episode, like, trying to, like, I am not a defender of Maddie Healy or of, like, conservatives from Spokane, Washington.
No,
and yet
neither.
here I am, like, I feel like I'm defending them, and I'm not.
Exactly. And I think it is this really tricky thing. And this is something that our company works with more generally. But it's basically like we have moved so much of our identity and so much to our value definition and so much of like the meaning making of our life has moved into fandom of various kinds. Yeah. And then you have that incredibly complicated moment where it's like, well, yeah, my entire political consciousness is influenced by Harry Potter. And now J.K. Rowling is like aggressively transphobic. It's like, well, does that mean my politics have been transphobic this whole time? Like, it's not like you can go back and undo your cultural attachments. So something that we work on at my company and that I think about a lot independent of it is just like, what is the non-toxic way to love your problematic fave? Like, what do you do with the fact that, like, okay, you've given Taylor Swift this position of incredible importance in your life, and she is, like, the number one greenhouse gas producing pop star with her private jets. How do you solve that dilemma? How do you indicate, like, I love her, but this is bad?
I found myself in one of the culture study threads the other day, like, again, defending private jets. And I'm like, what is wrong with me? But I was like, yeah, Taylor Swift needs private jets to go do, like that's messed up. But that's where we find ourselves.
It's messed up, but it's not untrue. It's like she lives an incredibly unsafe life. And like, I can slice it real fine. You know, initially when the guy who tracked all the celebrity jets was like tweeting out her location, they were like, this is an invasion of her privacy. You are making her vulnerable to stalkers. This is unacceptable. And he was like, oh, okay, great. I'll delay the notifications by 24 hours. Yeah. And I was like, great work. You solved it. And they were like, no, we're still suing you. And I was like, now you're not suing because of safety. You're suing because of image management.
Right.
And like, if you're going to use your private jet, we get to look and see how you're using your private jet. But I do think that we all also need like a responsible and sane way to cope with that information. And I don't think we have one right now.
This is great. This is a good segue to our next question, which is gets to this idea of like what's too much, what's not enough, all of that sort of thing. So this is from Stephanie.
I think I realized that celebrity outrage had gone too far when my friend said she didn't like a certain actor anymore, but she couldn't remember what he had done. She just knew she shouldn't like him. I have also felt this way, and it's exhausting. But I also find it annoying when someone has no idea what's going on and plays Kanye in a yoga class the same week he said some vile stuff. Do you think there's a happy medium between being engaged and being clueless and or not caring? Is it always essentially about picking your battles?
I feel like last week I was talking about a star and someone said, isn't he canceled?
Yeah.
And we debated for like 10 minutes. I was like, I don't think he's canceled. I don't think so. And that we had to like Google, is someone canceled? Right? Like that's such an umbrella understanding of us trying to affix bad good. as if
Right.
they're like roles in a melodrama to these
Yes.
various actors. And it is rarely that complex. But that's us trying to seek moral clarity, I think, particularly in a post-Me Too era moment.
Yeah.
But also this was happening to some extent before. Do you have a celebrity that you feel this way about? You're like, oh, like, is this person canceled? Like, I can't remember.
I mean, I think Aziz Ansari is like
Oh
the
my gosh,
most
yes.
complicated example of this.
Yeah.
Because his quote unquote expose felt like the moment that the internet agreed Me Too had gone too far. But also, his behavior is documented in that piece, which was mostly being like very pushy about wanting to receive oral sex and like not skilled and not considerate and kind of cold.
Yeah.
Wasn't great. And it wasn't aligned with his star image, which was very consciously feminist. And like feminist particularly around questions of casual dating, because he had written his like online dating guidebook with some social scientists.
Right.
So it is honestly something he should have been called out for. Probably not the way he was called out for it. But then it's like, well, because it came up from an inappropriate place, should we disregard it? Do I, as a feminist, do I just have to like hold a grudge against Aziz Ansari forever? He's since done comedy that like addressed the allegations and like demonstrated that he reckoned with it. We haven't had any further allegations. And it's like, well, wait, but isn't that what he's supposed to do?
Growth.
Like, isn't that the gallant path, right?
Yeah.
Like Louis C.K.'s over here goofus.
Right. Like, would we rather them like double down on being an asshole and like become a hero of the right, which some of them have done, right?
Would be very profitable. Like Aziz Ansari, maybe his agent is like, Aziz, couldn't you have just done your heel turn?
Seriously.
You'd gotten what you could from Netflix.
Yeah.
It's time for your Fox News era. They love Indian conservatives. But yeah, so it's one of those things where it's like, because we don't have a path to sort of reconciliation. We end up stuck where it's like, do I just have to feel chagrined for liking this person for the rest of my life? Luckily, I'm not that attached to Aziz Ansari's work. So it's more like a fascinating case study. I'm trying to think if I have any, like, I obviously have problematic faves. Like,
well,
I'm
and
a
like
human being in the world.
You know, our previous conversation about J.K. Rowling is instructive here because I think, and I know that like the work that your organization does is also thinking through this. Part of why, like, fandom has in some ways taken this secular position of moral guidance, right? Like, it is a way that in the absence of faith traditions that are meaningful to us, that we come up with senses of how the world works, ways of making things legible. Yes. And then when something happens that that questions that moral universe, right?
Or that unsettles it.
Yes.
Yeah.
The same way, like, people have crises of faith all of the time. So it makes sense that we also would have crises of fandom.
We just don't have any tools to deal with it.
Yes, that's the thing. Is that like, if you are within the church or within a religious organization and you have a crisis of faith, like, there are many different ways. Some of them, I think, like, more welcoming and understanding than others to work through that crisis of faith. And maybe you end up leaving the faith, maybe you don't, whatever it is. I don't think that we have established those mechanisms of care, self-care too, when we're having these crises of faith within a fandom.
And I think that it is absolutely right that like fandom serves the same role that like faith communities did back when faith communities had more meaning to more Americans.
Yeah.
But what is different is that within a faith community, the ways that community functioned as a community, right? And the way that it functioned as a way for making meaning from your life and understanding the world around you and building a moral consensus. Like, those things were all defined. And it is very accidental that fandom has become the place that we get this information from. And so we don't have these formalized paths defined for like, how do I take this feeling of community that I have and turn it into a community that actually functions in my life?
Yeah.
I put so much energy out to the things that I love. And I do so much work, both with like my time and my money and my energy, to demonstrate the importance of this thing to me. But do I know how to get some of that energy back from it? And faith traditions had a method for that. And so what our company does is we do apply faith tradition practices, but to secular material. And the idea, like, I lead a lot of Jane Austen pilgrimages, and the way I joke about it is it's like, well, I can often have a hard time taking my life seriously, but I've never had a hard time taking Jane Austen seriously. Like, that's always come very naturally to me. And when I am consciously putting my life in conversation with that, it can bring some of that seriousness back around to my life. It can dignify, like, the process of defining my own values. So I don't think I'm just navel gazing. It's like, no, like, I'm studying literature and I'm understanding my feelings, and I understand one of those things is important, and that makes the other one important too.
Yeah. Thank you for explaining too what your company does, because I think like even just the word company like it's not even like I feel like organization is a better word, right?
Because, I think like, organization is a great word.
Yes. Hey everyone, it's Anne. I wanted to catch you up on all the episodes we're working on so you have plenty of time to submit your questions. We're doing an episode on weird TikTok trends. So if there's something that you keep seeing on your For You page and you want an explainer, let us know. We're also looking for your questions and prompts for an episode about Ben Affleck with the great Jen Romolini, who just wrote a fantastic book about ambition. And we also want to hear from you about your favorite and least favorite home renovation shows and what they signal about class. Our guest for that one is Jonathan Menjivar, and I am so excited. He's the host of Classy. If any of these ideas spark something in you, submit your question at tinyurl.com/culturestudypod. And if none of them inspire you, head to the form anyways and tell us what you want to deep dive on. Again, that's tinyurl.com/culturestudypod. Okay, thanks, and back to the show. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about working through that conflict in yourself. This question comes from Kylie.
In the vein of celebrity anger, my best friend is a die-hard Swiftie who also seems to hate Taylor Swift. It's the wildest juxtaposition to me. She listens to her music frequently, tried maybe 10 times to get Eras tickets, even waking up at like 4 a.m. once to try, and follows all the Taylor stuff online. And yet, when she talks about her, it's almost with vitriol and constant criticism. Like she loves her, but hates her as a public figure. Some of the critique is super valid, and I totally agree with it. But I'm curious what that is and if there are larger patterns of this. Is it internalized misogyny, a grudge over not being able to get tickets, valid criticisms? It's interesting to see a super fan publicly hate this person whose art they truly, deeply love. It's very conflicting feelings.
I kind of want to interview this person. Because I wonder if it is like is it that this person is working through exactly what we were talking about, like using their fandom of Taylor Swift to also reflect on what do I believe in my life? How do I think commerce should work, right? Like, how do I think all of these different things should work? So that might be the case, right? That they're doing some self-interrogation. But part of me also thinks that maybe they're embarrassed.
Yeah. I mean, it was very funny because the caller gave a list of a bunch of different things that it could be. And I was like, well, I think the answer to this question is like, yes. Like, yes, it's frustration at how difficult it is to access Taylor Swift's art. And like, just she's so good at being a capitalist. And you can just like feel all of that value being mined out of you. And you're like, oh. Right. I can't not buy this commemorative new vinyl, but also I resent you for knowing how to make me buy it. And it's like, is it internalized misogyny? It's like, oh, isn't everything? And then like, is it valid critique? Like, absolutely, of course it's valid critique.
Right. Like, am I also conscious of the ways that like I need to counter performance of fandom, which might be like overly feminized with like a critique that kind of cool girl negates it, right? Like, exhausting. That's, first of all, that sounds exhausting to me, but yes.
Sure. I mean, living in the world as a woman is exhausting.
Yeah.
The first thing that I thought of when I read this question was James Baldwin said, it's like, I love America more than any other country in the world. And exactly for this reason, I insist on the right to criticize her perpetually. It's like, you know, put in Taylor Swift and pop star. And like, that's, I feel like the sentiment. It's like, if you have dedicated all this time and energy to loving her, there is this sense of like, okay, so she owes me to like not embarrass me in public. She owes me
not embarrass me in public.
To like make her tickets harder to scalp. And I think, unfortunately, like that's probably not a bargain that Taylor Swift has really made with you.
Yeah. Yeah, no, I love like this idea like she owes me. And this gets to the larger question that we're talking about for this episode, which is like, what does a celebrity owe you? And I think sometimes there's a position that a celebrity owes you nothing. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, right? Like you have paid them attention. You have an adoration and dedication and money, and often in many cases that does not mean that the relationship is purely transactional and that like everything that you give them in terms of attention they must give you in terms of like responding to that attention. But I don't think it's an unfair expectation to say like I do reserve the right to criticize the people that I love.
But what I think we have to undo is like the great evil of the early aughts blogging era, which is what I like to call search engine optimized outrage, right?
Yeah.
Like we had a lot of underemployed academics who really wanted to talk about like intersectional feminism.
Margaret,
but they couldn't just write about intersectional feminism. It had to be like Miley Cyrus at the VMAs, like how she got intersectional feminism wrong.
Or the BuzzFeed style of this was because like the people who were writing these were not people who were writing op-eds, like they were not writing personal essays. It was people who their responsibility was to look at Twitter and say blank, 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 celebrity did blank, and people are mad or the internet is mad.
Yeah, this was one of the most frustrating things about going deep on Maddie Healy is the number of like responsible outlets that were not reporting context, that were just reporting outrage. And I was like, no, literally, I'm so sorry. The cut, like your job as journalists for New York Magazine is to include the context. And you're not. You're just answering the search engine question of why should I hate Maddie Healy?
Right.
Right. And they're like, this is why people hate Maddie Healy right now.
Yeah.
And no further thought about the legitimacy of it. So because we've search engine optimized it, it turns celebrity into this highly politicized space where like your fandom is a political action. And therefore you conduct it with the same degree of rigor and intensity that James Baldwin conducted his relationship with the country of America.
Yes.
And that's a little misplaced.
Well, and this is interesting, right? Because like the way that some of these larger stars position themselves, or that the amount of importance that we have mapped onto them as celebrities, both in our own lives, but also societally, right? Like the ideologies that they have come to represent are America, right? Like Beyonce is America. Like she actually explicitly is like, okay, we're interrogating all these things about in this album about America, right? But then also Taylor Swift is Americana. Like there are these ways that critiquing them is in essence a way of critiquing society. But I absolutely agree with you that what happens is this like incredible disarticulation of that as a conversation, right? Mm-hmm. And this is why like a couple of months ago, I wrote about Taylor Swift and like being like the pressure to be the nice girl, right? And like I had to put a paragraph at the top that said like, I need to be very clear here that I like Taylor Swift. And I think that it's important that we are able to also have a conversation about her. And that doesn't mean that I'm a bad feminist. That doesn't mean that like I don't like her music or like doesn't mean that I hate her, which is oftentimes the knee-jerk response is like, you just hate Taylor Swift or you're just jealous, which is one that I have gotten since I started writing about celebrity. Like the first piece I ever wrote that went viral on my old free WordPress blog was about Kristen Stewart and Robert Pattinson. And the response was like, you are just jealous because you want to be dating Robert Pattinson. And I was like, I love K-Stu. I love this relationship. What's wrong with you?
This is one of my favorite things that I've sort of been able to define again through my work with Not Sorry is like we talk about like you treat things as sacred, right? And like what does it mean to treat something as sacred? And I think when we ascribe so much importance to a person's work with fandom, it is a form of treating something as sacred. And what it reads to people as, and what some stans understand it to be, is like, this is sacrosanct. You can't criticize it. Right. And what I say is that we are operating more in the academic tradition, where it's like you show your devotion through the rigor of your engagement. I think Taylor Swift is incredibly important. And that means I think she can withstand my critical gaze.
Right.
She's not diminished by it. She grows in stature because she is creating work that is worthy of being studied and engaged with this way.
Absolutely.
And so this is a little bit what I feel like people need to do in terms of like, how do you resolve this problem? Is it's like, okay, you love Taylor Swift and you also observe that she has a lot of personal and political failings.
Or contradictions, right?
Or contradictions. Contradictions. Better word. What do you do with that? I think you reflect and you're like, okay, what is it in my value system that feels outraged by her actions? Right? And you're like, oh, it's like, she's a billionaire and I think that's morally corrupt. And it's like, okay, well, maybe do a mutual aid fundraiser. Right? I think we need to start looking at our relationship with celebrities not as the place where we do politics, but as the space where we discern politics. And then once you've used it as a tool of discernment, you go and you do your politics somewhere else. Overall, I think that is going to be a vastly more satisfying relationship with Taylor Swift than what your poor friend has right now, which sounds really tiring.
So this is an elegant transition into talking about the only person that we got more submissions about than Maddie Healy, which is John Mulaney.
Yeah.
Let's talk about where we go from here with this one. This is from Jesse.
I know why I felt so betrayed when John Mulaney cheated on his wife, but what do I do with that anger? Like, I'm still over here liking his ex-wife's posts in solidarity, and Mulaney's kid with his new partner is basically in preschool.
I loved this question.
Okay, so let's do a little breakdown of what happened, just for people who are utterly unfamiliar. We don't have to go deep, but we can get the basics.
John Mulaney got famous as a comic, and one of the kind of cornerstones of his comedy was that he was very clean cut. And he had not always been. He was open about having struggles with addiction before becoming famous. But he was clean cut in his act. And also in his act, he was married to, his terminology, like a pushy Jewish woman. And it was a life-changing experience for him as an emotionally constipated Catholic boy. And like, he did a lot of material about them that was very charming. And they had a very adorable French bulldog that they owned together. And that was very charming. And their relationship happened in public. And all of that was very charming. And then very suddenly, it's like he relapsed into addiction. He went into rehab. He came out of rehab. And he was getting divorced from the very adorable wife and having a relationship and a baby with Olivia Munn. And that is after many, many years of saying publicly, like, he didn't want to be a father with his previous partner. And that was just like a real cocktail. Like, this was the day that we all learned what parasocial relationships are.
Right.
It's like,
no,
why
I
are
remember
you so mad
that
at
so
John
vividly.
Mulaney?
I was like, wow, I didn't know so many people had a parasocial relationship with John Mulaney. Who I really
too.
like. Oh, hello, his sketch.
He's great.
with Nick Kroll is like an incredibly. It's like I love it.
He came out for like 60 seconds at the Oscars, and I was like, "Oh, damn it! I still love John Mulaney. He's great.
Know, and he did like
so
the
funny.
kids special that was so good.
Yeah.
During the pandemic. So this question asker says, I know why I'm so mad, right?
Right.
But I think that she's answering her own question. Like, what do I do with that anger? She's like, oh, I'm still liking all of his ex-wife stuff. Like, yeah. I mean, the thing is that you're still angry. You're still angry because it's easy, I think, for a lot of people to identify with the ex-wife in this position.
Yeah, Anna Marie Tendler, who at the time of their relationship was primarily a makeup artist. And since then, she's like publishing a memoir. She's done some really fascinating photography exhibits. Like, she's gone on to really grow in her artistic work on her own time.
And it's easy, just like that whole, no matter, even if you weren't that connected to John Mulaney, like even if your parasocial relationship wasn't that strong, that whole idea of like, I was with a guy who said he didn't want kids, and then like he had basically a midlife crisis and many different.
And now suddenly,
and now he's like, oh, and also Olivia Munn, you know, I don't know much about Olivia Munn's star image other than part of it is classic vixen.
She also is sort of peak cool girl,
Yeah.
right? Because it wasn't just vixen. She also came up through, like, I think Spike TV.
Yeah.
Where she was sort of like a booth babe who was allowed to make jokes.
Yes. And in like the guys club of like funny women.
Right. Very much on their terms, just like the famous cool girl monologue indicates from Gillian Flynn's Gone Girl. Like, the cool girl always exists on men's terms.
Right.
It's embodying a male fantasy that is inherently threatening to women because you're like, oh, well, this is just telling them this exists.
Right. Right. Yeah. That like there's always this option for you to go to.
Right. And that's one of those things where it's like you may not even know these things about her, but like you probably read a tweet one time that was like, Olivia Munn, how she illustrates like the cool girl mythos.
Right. So in your head, Olivia Munn lives in your head as a cool girl, right? So it's what this move represents. And so you have this anger over what this represents. And it feels like, I think this question asker feels maybe impotent that like there's nothing to do with that anger except press like on the ex-wife's post. But I think maybe that, like you said, like that's part of the processing is saying like, what do I do with this anger? I am supportive of this woman and who she is becoming.
Yeah, I'm going to look at her art exhibit.
Yeah.
I'm going to see these photographs that she took. I'm going to buy her memoir. And it's not just out of solidarity. It's like the reason it was such a betrayal is because Anna Marie Tendler's identity informed your understanding of who John Mulaney was. Like, she's not just identifiable as the one being left. She herself brought a value to the relationship. And it's like basically saying, okay, well, John Mulaney introduced me to this woman, but like I identify and I think that she is very cool. And so now I am just going to continue being a fan of her. Like, that's a great way to deal with the anger. Is give this woman your attention and let her see what she can do with it. And as it happens, she's done great stuff with it.
This is a fantastic place for us to stop. But we also have a really great Ask Anne Anything question that Melody emailed with this question last night. And was like, do you think that Margaret would answer this? I was like, I think she will.
She definitely will.
It's a question about the state of online dating in 2024. So if you want to hear that question and our advice, head over to culturestudypod.substack.com and become a paid subscriber. Margaret, where can people find you? Other places on the internet? Like, tell us about the pilgrimages that are not yet full, where people can learn more about them. That would be great.
Okay, so the number one place to sort of follow me is on my Instagram. I am there as Mrs. Friday Next. For my company would be the next place to go. And so if you go to notsorryworks.com, you'll see information about classes I'm teaching. Like, I'm going to have a listening party for the Tortured Poets department in May. So if you want to come and talk while we listen to that album with a bunch of other people who care about Taylor Swift as passionately as you do, this is a great space for that. Similarly, I am running a Taylor Swift pilgrimage on Cape Cod, focused on folklore and evermore, and that's going to be in November. Melody may or may not be coming on that pilgrimage. I'll leave it up to Melody if she wants to identify herself.
It's true, I'm coming.
So that's like a double bonus. You get time with me and you get time with Melody. And I teach a bunch of other classes through them and lead other trips. My two main focuses at this moment in time are Jane Austen and Taylor Swift. But fittingly enough, I'm in the process of designing the curriculum for like a how to online date sustainably class. So
really? We didn't even know that.
No, you had no idea. But
that's amazing.
It was just, you guys, really, it was great timing. So if anything I said on that seemed valuable, keep your eyes open. And then finally, I too have a Substack email, much like Anne Helen Peterson does. Mine is twobossydames.substack.com. And that's another great place to keep track of my work.
Amazing. Thank you so much. This has been an utter delight.
Oh, I had so much fun. Thank you guys for having me.
Thanks for listening to the Culture Study Podcast. Be sure to subscribe wherever you get your podcasts because we have so many great episodes in the works, and I promise that you don't want to miss any of them. But to make these future episodes, we need subscribers. That's how we make money. We are not beholden to any company that tells us what we can and cannot do an episode about. And in order for that to work, we have to get money from somewhere, right? And we have a couple of advertisements, but really we rely on subscribers. So if you want this show to continue, consider whether you might become a paid subscriber. It's only $5 a month or $50 a year. And if you're already a subscriber to Culture Study, the newsletter, you get a really great deal. It's down to, I think, $3 a month. So that's less than $1 an episode. That's a fantastic deal. Go to culturestudypod.substack.com, and it's so easy to make that conversion and become a subscriber today. The Culture Study Podcast is produced by me, Anne Helen Peterson, and Melody Rowell. Our music is by Poddington Bear, and you can find me on Instagram at Anne Helen Peterson and Melody at Melodious47, and the show at Culture Study Pod.